A retired Navy SEAL was hunting in the snow when his dog suddenly froze. The dog stood completely still, sensing something was wrong and silently warning his owner. Minutes later, he found a little girl bleeding and unconscious in the forest. She wasn't lost. She was hiding from someone who was already looking for her. The dog refused to leave her side, staying close as if he knew her life depended on both of them. What followed was not just a rescue, but a battle against fear, truth, and the past. Before we begin, tell us where you're watching from, and if this story touches you, like and subscribe so we can reach 1,000 subscribers and share more stories like this. By early June, Birch Harbor looked like the kind of town postcards lied about. The lake shone too cleanly. The white birch trees trembled in the breeze like handfuls of silver coins. Neat cedar houses climbed the hills above the shoreline, their windows catching the cold northern sunlight, their porches smelling faintly of pine sap, coffee, and whatever pies had been cooling on kitchen counters since dawn. Workers were already stringing banners across Main Street for the Water Festival, the pride of the town, the annual proof that winter had not won after all. It was the sort of place that invited people to believe in simple things. Gideon Vale had lived there long enough to know simple things were usually the first ones to lie. At 41, Gideon still moved like a man trained to conserve motion. He stood a little over 6 feet tall, with the lean, compact build of someone who had once carried too much weight over too much bad ground. His face was clean-shaven, the square jaw and sharp cheekbones fully exposed, as if he had no use for hiding behind anything softer. His dark brown hair was cut in a military style, slightly longer than regulation, practical without trying to look severe. His skin was fair beneath the weathering left by northern wind and long days outdoors, and his gray-blue eyes had the wary stillness of a man who rarely looked at anything without also calculating exits. He wore the same clothes he wore almost every day, an old olive-gray tactical combat shirt softened by years of washing, worn pale at the shoulders and cuffs, earth-brown combat pants with frayed knees and slightly sagging cargo pockets, old military work boots, and a scratched watch that had outlived better men than he had. To the town, Gideon was the quiet mechanic on the ridge above the lake. The veteran, the one who fixed boat engines, replaced broken pulleys, patched generators, and answered in short sentences that were polite enough to end conversation before it started. To himself, he was a man who had learned the difference between solitude and peace, and had only been granted one of them. The only creature in his life that never pretended was Rook. The German Shepherd was 4, maybe 5, with a yellow and black coat that caught sunlight like old brass and shadow. A black saddle stretched across his back. His muzzle was dark, his chest and legs a warm, tawny gold. He had the strong, efficient build of a working dog, all balance and intent, with erect ears that turned toward distant sounds before any human could hear them. Around his neck sat an old dark brown leather collar, weathered but well kept, with a plain metal tag stamped with one word: Rook. Rook usually moved with calm confidence. He was not a nervous dog, nor a noisy one. He watched first, judged second, acted only when necessary. That was why Gideon noticed when the dog changed. It began 3 days before the festival. Rook started leaving food in his bowl. Not much, but enough. He spent long stretches of the morning standing on the porch, head lifted toward the far end of the lake where the old ferry dock rotted into the reeds. Sometimes he gave a low sound in his throat. Not a bark, not quite a growl, but something quieter and stranger, like disagreement with something unseen. Gideon checked the tree line for black bears, scanned the hillside for deer with injuries, even looked for signs of coyotes. He found nothing. On the second day, Rook refused to follow him into town until Gideon clipped the leash on and gave the command twice. On the third, the dog woke from sleep with a sharp, stifled whine, rose from the rug by the stove, and stood motionless in the moonlight pooling on the cabin floor. Gideon sat up in bed, instantly awake in the old way. Heart steady, mind blank, body already listening. "What is it?" he asked softly. Rook did not look at him. He stared toward the lake. Gideon got out of bed, crossed to the window, and saw only darkness silvered by thin cloud. The old ferry dock was too far away to make out clearly from the ridge, but he felt something move through him then, not fear exactly, something colder, more disciplined, recognition without evidence, the kind of feeling men survived by obeying and were haunted by afterward. He told himself it was nothing. That lie lasted until the rain came. It was a thin midnight drizzle, barely more than mist, when Rook began clawing at the front door, not the impatient scratching of a dog wanting outside. This was urgent, rhythmic, almost angry. Gideon was halfway into his boots by the time the sound fully registered. He grabbed a flashlight, shrugged into a jacket, and opened the door. Rook shot into the wet darkness without waiting. The old ferry dock lay at the far edge of Birch Harbor, beyond the last well-kept homes, beyond the boat rental sheds and festival scaffolding, where the shoreline turned rough and the town preferred not to look too closely. The dock had been abandoned for years after ice damage and funding cuts, left to weather into a gray-brown skeleton over black water and reeds. By the time Gideon reached it, his shoulders were damp with mist, and the beam of his flashlight cut a pale tunnel through the rain. Rook was standing at the edge of the dock, rigid. Gideon swept the light downward and saw the first thing, a child's handkerchief, caught beneath a warped plank, soaked with mud. A cheap one, blue-bordered, the kind sold in multi-packs at the general store. Nearby, barely visible beneath the wash of rainwater, lay a tiny smear of blood. Not enough for panic. Enough for memory. He crouched, the bad feeling inside him tightening like wire. The dock boards were slick, swollen from weather, and one section near the far post had been disturbed recently. A plank sat crooked. When Gideon pried it aside, the flashlight beam landed on something carved into the wood beneath. A triangle. 3 slashes crossing it. Crude, fast, unmistakable. For one suspended second, the lake, the rain, the dog, the smell of wet timber, all of it fell away. He was somewhere hotter, dirtier, half a world from this clean northern water. He saw canvas snapping in desert wind, heard rotors beating dust into the air, smelled blood turning metallic in heat. That symbol had existed there too, scratched onto a crate that had no business being where it was, handled by men whose names never entered reports. A black operation, a buried failure, a mark that should have stayed dead. Rook made a sound, and Gideon came back hard, as though dropped from a height. He said nothing on the walk home. The next morning, Birch Harbor woke into panic. Milo Brennan was missing. The news ran through the town faster than fire through dry grass. Milo was 11, bright-eyed, restless, forever climbing where he shouldn't, biking too far, asking too many questions. He belonged to the kind of family everybody knew by sight. His mother at church suppers, his older sister Tessa carrying grocery bags with one hip. Milo himself always trailing some new fascination, fishing lures, flashlight batteries, drone parts, Rocks, he insisted, were fossils. By 8:30, volunteers were gathering in the church lot. Men in caps and denim jackets, women in rain shells with coffee thermoses, teenagers trying to look useful. Search routes were mapped on folding tables. The sheriff's department parked 2 cruisers by the curb. Sheriff Dorian Kells stood near the hood of one of them, broad and heavy-shouldered in his brown uniform, speaking with the calm authority expected of a man who had worn a badge too long to sound uncertain. He was in his early 50s, big-framed, his face lined and fleshy around the mouth, his brown-gray eyes shadowed by poor sleep and older compromises. There had once been something decent in him, Gideon thought. Maybe there still was, buried deep under duty, exhaustion, and whatever bargains a man told himself did not count. Kid probably wandered farther into the East Trail than he meant to, Kells was saying. Rain came in, lost his bearings. We'll bring him back. It was a reasonable statement. That was what made it dangerous. Standing a few feet away was Deputy Owen Mercer, younger by at least 20 years and not yet good at hiding what he thought. Owen was around 30, leaner than his sheriff, with clear light eyes, short brown-blonde hair, and the alert posture of a man still trying to deserve the uniform on his back. His expression carried the strain of someone caught between respect and doubt. "We should search the old dock, too," Owen said, "and the shoreline south of it. There's mud disruption there from the festival cruise, but—" Kells cut him off without even turning his head. "The dock's already contaminated. Half the town's been through there setting up stage supports and lights. Rain washed out what's left. Use your teams where they'll do some good." Owen's jaw tightened. He nodded because that was what subordinates did in public. Gideon noticed. He noticed, too, how many boots had already passed through the lower streets near the lake. Festival workers, volunteers, officers, town trucks. If there had been tracks near the ferry dock at dawn, they were gone now. If there had been anything clean to find, the town itself had trampled it into confusion. That should have made Gideon speak. Instead, it made him shut up. Because a muddy handkerchief and a fading blood mark were one thing. A carved military symbol was another. Too little to prove. Too much to say aloud carelessly. If that mark meant what he thought it meant, then whoever had carved it did not belong in a small-town missing person case. And if the wrong ears heard Gideon mention it before he had more, anything still hidden would vanish before honest people even knew where to look. He hated that thought. He hated more that it felt correct. Late that afternoon, when most of the volunteer teams had shifted toward the east woods, Gideon took Rook down to the public shoreline just to watch. The dog ignored the people, ignored the boats, ignored the gulls. Then, without warning, Rook stopped, turned his head toward the old ferry dock across the water, and lowered himself into a crouch so slowly it made the skin on Gideon's arms rise. Not fear, not aggression. Reverence, almost. As if the dog were listening to something speaking through distance. A little girl nearby dropped her paper cup and whispered to her mother, "Why is he bowing?" Rook's ears flicked once. His gaze never moved. For one strange, breath-held moment, Gideon felt the irrational certainty that the dog was not staring at wood and reeds and ruined pilings. He was waiting for permission. Then a truck backfired on Main Street. The spell broke, and Rook rose again as if nothing had happened. But Gideon could not shake the feeling. He had seen dogs react to scent, to threat, to blood, to fear. This had been something else. Not mystical, exactly. More unnerving than that. instinct so pure it looked like faith. By evening, the town had found nothing. Birch Harbor lit itself anyway. Festival lamps along the waterfront came on one by one, their reflections trembling across the darkening lake like candles set adrift. From his porch, high on the ridge, Gideon watched those lights burn in a line and thought of how easily people mistook illumination for safety. The air smelled of wet cedar and distant smoke. Behind him, the cabin stood quiet. Before him, the town tried to believe itself normal. Rook came to stand at his left side, close enough that Gideon could feel the warmth of the dog through his pants leg. The German shepherd's body was still. Every muscle gathered but restrained. His amber-brown eyes fixed once more on the far end of the shore where the old ferry dock hunched in darkness. Gideon followed that stare. He knew now that Rook was not reacting to a random trail left by a wounded animal or some scavenger rooting through reeds. The dog had chosen that place again and again, with the stubborn focus of something that had already judged the truth before the man beside him was willing to name it. Somewhere beyond those broken boards and black water, a door was opening, and on the other side of it, Gideon could feel his past beginning to breathe. By morning, Birch Harbor had changed shape. It was still beautiful. That was the cruel part. Sunlight still spilled over the lake in pale sheets. The birch trunks still flashed white between the pines. Festival banners still snapped over Main Street, as if the town had not gone to bed with fear in its throat. But beauty had become a thin thing now, stretched over panic like skin over a bruise. Search parties moved in careful grids through the woods, along the shoreline, past the old rail spur, around vacant cabins with peeling paint and locked summer shutters. People spoke in lowered voices, as though grief might hear its own name and arrive faster. Every porch seemed occupied. Every pickup truck idled too long. Every mother in town looked at her children as if counting them by sight might keep them from vanishing. Gideon stayed away from the church parking lot, where maps were being unfolded and folded again under anxious hands. He did not trust the comfort of crowds. Crowds loved procedure. Procedure loved the most obvious explanation. Missing children were supposed to have simple reasons: wandering off, twisted ankle, fear of punishment, wrong turn in the woods. But the small blood smear beneath the rain at the old dock had not felt simple. Neither had the symbol. Rook paced the porch while Gideon checked the magazine in the pistol he hoped not to need, then slid it back into the drawer. The dog had regained none of his appetite. He had eaten half his breakfast only because Gideon stood beside him until he did. Now he moved with quiet intensity, circling once, twice, then stopping at the top step and looking down toward the road as if something below the ridge had already made up its mind. "Show me," Gideon said. That was all it took. Rook trotted ahead, not pulling wildly, not acting like a dog chasing scent in confusion. He moved with the deliberate focus of an animal that had sorted the world and chosen a direction. Gideon followed him down the hill, past the bait shop and the marina road, keeping to the lake edge instead of joining the search teams fanning east toward the woods. If Milo had been taken by panic, the woods made sense. If Milo had been taken by someone else, sense was no longer the right map. Near the public square, he saw Mayor Harlan Pike speaking to a knot of volunteers. Pike looked exactly like the kind of man people trusted in a crisis. 57, tall and impeccably kept, with silver-brown hair combed neatly to one side, and a statesman's posture that seemed permanently prepared for photographs. His blue-gray eyes carried practiced concern. His blazer was too well pressed for the circumstances, his voice smooth enough to calm strangers. The sort of man who could make bad news sound temporary and his own presence sound like part of the cure. "Keep to your assigned sectors," Pike was saying, one hand resting lightly on the shoulder of a frightened father. "We'll find him. Birch Harbor takes care of its own." People nodded because they needed to. Gideon did not stop walking. Rook did something subtle as they passed. His ears eased backward, not in fear, not even hostility, but in a kind of contained suspicion. He did not growl. He simply kept Pike in the corner of his vision until they were clear of the square. Gideon noticed that too. The dog led him past the last stretch of well-maintained lawns and down toward the rougher northern edge of town, where the lake narrowed and the land rose in rows of apple trees. The orchard belonged to Maribel Shaw. From a distance, the place looked postcard perfect. Long lines of trees with early leaves shimmering under a mild wind. Ladders leaned against trunks. Old wooden crates stacked beside a red barn that had weathered enough winters to earn its faded paint. Up close, the orchard carried another feeling too. Work, wear, and the quiet stubbornness of a place kept alive by one person, refusing to let grief repossess it. Maribel emerged from between the trees carrying a coil of hose over one arm. She was around 38, tall enough to stand nearly level with Gideon's shoulder when the ground rose under her boots, with a lean, capable frame shaped by outdoor labor instead of fashion. Her dark chestnut hair was tied back low, not neatly but efficiently, a few strands loose around a face that was both strong and tired in a way that could not be blamed on a single bad night. Her skin held the warm, fair tone of someone who worked under open skies. Her eyes, amber brown, steady, observant, were the sort that had learned how to measure a person before deciding whether kindness was safe. She wore a faded denim jacket over a cream Henley, dark jeans, and work boots stained by soil and weather. No jewelry beyond a plain wedding band she still had not taken off. Rook slowed when he saw her, but he did not soften. He veered past her instead, nose low. "Gideon," Maribel said. Her voice was calm but thinner than usual. "You shouldn't be out here alone." "I'm not." Her gaze dropped to Rook. "Fair point." They both watched the dog move toward the rear boundary of the orchard, where a narrow utility path ran between the last trees and a strip of lakeside brush. Grass there had been flattened in two rough swaths, as if something heavy had rolled or been dragged across it recently. Beside the path lay an old oil tarp partly hidden under dead weeds and rain-dark leaves. Maribel's expression changed first. Not fear exactly, but recognition sharpened by dread. "I saw a boat that night," she said quietly. Gideon straightened. "When?" "The same night Milo disappeared. Past midnight. No lights. Just the motor sound, and the wake if you knew where to look." She swallowed once, eyes on the brush, not on him. "It pulled away from the old ferry side and cut north. 2 adults, I think, maybe more. And something small under a tarp." "Why didn't you tell Kells?" A humorless breath escaped her. "Because 5 years ago I told Sheriff Kells my husband's boat didn't drift by itself. I told him the rope was cut too clean, and the hull mark on the dock wasn't accidental." She looked at Gideon now, and the hurt beneath her steadiness showed. He wrote it down, nodded kindly, and filed my grief under weather. That explained the way she held herself. Upright, careful, composed with effort. Some losses did not make people fragile. They made them economical. Rook began scraping at the brush. Gideon crouched beside him and pulled the oil tarp free. Beneath it lay a military-style handheld radio, its battery missing, mud fresh along one corner, and a sharp residue of engine oil on the casing. Not local hunting gear. Not the sort of thing summer drunks bought for fun. Something more disciplined than that. Rook sniffed it once, then twice, and lifted his head abruptly to stare at Gideon. Not the radio. Gideon. The look landed harder than it should have. For one disorienting second, he was not standing in an orchard under northern sun, but back inside a tan-walled operations tent. Metal hot enough to burn. Heat pressing against canvas. A radio hissing coordinates over the smell of dust and blood. Rook had never been there. He was too young. Another dog. Another life. Another desert. Yet something in this scent had bridged years like rotten boards over black water. Gideon forced himself back to the present and unscrewed the battery compartment. Folded tight inside was a scrap of paper with handwritten coordinates. Alder Slip. A small abandoned island near the center north of the lake, barely more than a low rise with an old fuel shed and a ruined dock. Maribel read his face before he spoke. That means something. It means whoever used this radio didn't drop it by accident. Before she could answer, a pickup approached along the orchard lane and stopped hard enough to kick gravel. Deputy Owen Mercer stepped out from behind the wheel, glancing once over his shoulder as if making sure he had not been followed. Up close in daylight, Owen looked even younger than he had beside Kells. 30 at most, with a clear, earnest face that had not yet learned how to go dull in uniform. His deputy's shirt sat a little too stiff across his shoulders, as though he still wore responsibility with conscious effort. The tension around his mouth suggested a man unused to disobeying orders, and even less used to feeling correct when he did. "There you are," he said, too fast. "I couldn't call. Kells is listening to radio traffic himself." He went back to the truck and opened the passenger door. A teenage girl climbed out reluctantly. Tessa Brennan was 16 and looked older only in the ways fear ages the face. She had long brown hair pulled into a hasty ponytail, a flannel shirt over a white tee, pale skin gone paler still, and the tight, controlled movements of someone trying not to spill apart in front of adults. She clutched her own elbows rather than the truck door, as if holding herself together required both hands. "This is off the record," Owen said. Tessa glanced from him to Gideon to Rook, and her eyes stopped on the dog. Something like hope flickered there, not because she trusted miracles, but because she had run out of better options. "Milo made a video," she said. Gideon said nothing, letting silence do its work. "A few nights ago, for school, he was filming the lake with his drone because he wanted to edit fog into it and make it look haunted." Her voice faltered, then steadied again. "He said he saw a boat out after dark. He called it a ghost boat because it had no lights. But he was excited, not scared. He told me he got someone's face in the shot when the drone dipped low." Maribel drew in a quiet breath. "Whose face?" Gideon asked. Tessa shook her head sharply. "He didn't know for sure. He said it looked like someone from town, someone he'd seen before. I told him to delete it if he was spying on people. He laughed at me." She swallowed hard. "Then yesterday morning he was gone. Do you still have the video?" "No." Shame moved across her face like a shadow. "Milo kept the card. He always kept the cards because he liked sorting files himself. I thought I'd have time to make him show me later." Owen shifted, jaw clenched. "That's why I brought her to you instead of Kells. If the kid saw somebody local and that somebody had help, he didn't finish. He didn't need to. Rook moved to Tessa without warning. He was a large dog, intimidating on first sight, but he approached her with a strange gentleness, head lowered, steps slow, ears tipped forward. He stopped just in front of her knees and looked up. Tessa froze. Then Rook pressed his nose lightly against the sleeve of her flannel and gave one soft exhale, almost a sigh. Something in the girl's face broke, not into hysteria, into belief. "Milo fed him once," she whispered, staring down at the dog. "At the dock, a week ago. We were fishing and Milo gave him half his sandwich because he said military dogs deserved better than store-brand ham." Gideon felt the world shift a fraction. Rook sat down at Tessa's feet as if he had been waiting for that truth to arrive. For one small, aching moment, it no longer felt like the dog was just following a trail. It felt as though some thin line had been tied between boy and beast days before anyone knew it mattered. A line of scent, memory, kindness, obligation. The kind of thing no report could file and no court could explain, yet men ignored at their cost. Tessa's fingers trembled as she rested them on the dog's head. "If he remembers Milo," she said, not finishing because she didn't have to. Gideon looked at the coordinates in his hand. Milo had seen something. Someone had taken him because of it. And Rook, for reasons older than logic and simpler than faith, had already chosen whose absence mattered. The mood broke when Owen checked the road again. "I have to get back before Kells notices I'm gone too long," he said. "If you're thinking what I think you're thinking, don't tell me details, just—" He hesitated, then met Gideon's eyes with the raw honesty of a man stepping over an invisible line. "If you don't come back by morning, I'll know where to start." Gideon folded the coordinate slip and pocketed it. Maribel crossed her arms against the breeze, though the day was not cold. "Alder Slip," she said quietly. "That old fuel island. You know it? Everybody knows it. Nobody uses it." She looked toward the lake, face hardening. "That makes it useful." Gideon nodded once. He did not tell Owen about the carved symbol at the dock. He did not tell Maribel what the radio smell had stirred loose in his memory. He did not tell Tessa that the shape of this thing now felt far larger than a local kidnapping. Some truths were not kindness when spoken before their time. But by the time the sun slanted west and the orchard shadows lengthened into blue bars between the trees, he had assembled enough of the shape to fear it. The radio, the tarp, the midnight boat, the hidden coordinates, a local face on a drone card, an 11-year-old boy taken not in rage but in efficiency. This was no accident. And what unsettled Gideon most was not only the evidence. It was Rook's response to the radio itself, that impossible, searching look, as if the dog had found not just a scent, but an old wound wearing a new name. At dusk, Gideon returned to the cabin, packed a flashlight, rope, first aid kit, boat fuel, and the kind of silence men carried when they knew explanation would only weaken resolve. Rook watched every movement, alert and ready, not restless anymore. Focus had replaced agitation. Purpose had calmed him. When Gideon stepped outside, the lake was darkening to steel. Far below, Birch Harbor glowed gently along the shore, pretending at normal life for one more evening. Somewhere in that calm light, people were still pinning hope onto search maps and coffee cups and official voices. Gideon trusted none of it. He knelt once beside Rook and took the dog's muzzle in both hands. "We go in quiet," he murmured, Rook held his gaze. No hesitation. No fear. Just that same absolute attention that had carried them to the dock, the orchard, the radio, the truth hiding in plain sight. Down at the boathouse, Gideon untied the skiff and pushed it into the black water. Rook stepped in first, balanced and certain, his silhouette cutting clean against the last band of light on the horizon. Gideon followed. He did not inform Sheriff Kells. He sent Owen only a single brief message. "If I'm not back by sunrise, start with Alder Slip." Then he cut the engine low, turned the bow toward the dark shape of the abandoned island, and let the lake open before them. Alder Slip rose out of the lake like the spine of something long dead. By the time Gideon cut the engine and let the skiff drift the last stretch, the water had gone black and metallic under the moon. The abandoned island was little more than a low hump of rock, reeds, and wind-bent scrub, with an old fuel shed crouched near the center, and a broken dock sagging into the shallows. In daylight, it would have looked forgotten. At night, it looked hidden on purpose. Gideon tied the skiff in silence and stepped into knee-high grass slick with dew. Rook jumped out beside him without a sound. The German shepherd's yellow and black coat seemed to swallow light rather than catch it. Only the pale gold of his legs and the sharp outline of his ears gave him away. He moved low and controlled, not with the excited pull of a dog on fresh scent, but with the disciplined economy of an animal that understood danger had weight and direction. The wind carried old fuel, wet wood, and something else underneath. Human sweat dried into canvas, stale food, iodine, fear. Gideon rested one hand briefly on Rook's neck. The dog's muscles felt tight but steady. "Easy," he murmured. The word was for both of them. They came in from the western side of the island, where the brush had overgrown the old service path, and the dock posts leaned like broken teeth out of the water. Gideon kept the flashlight off. Moonlight was enough in open ground, and darkness was safer than a beam announcing itself to anyone with a weapon and patience. The fuel shed stood ahead, a squat structure of warped boards and rusted metal panels. One window had been patched from the inside with plywood, but the rear door no longer hung square on its frame. A chain had been looped around the handle in a lazy show of security, the kind meant to keep out drunks or curious teenagers, not someone who knew how to slip a gap quietly. Gideon listened for 30 seconds before he touched it. No voices, no footsteps, no radio hiss. Only the lake, the grass, and the faint tapping of loose metal somewhere in the wind. He eased the chain free and went in first. The air inside the shed was colder than outside and thick with the sour mixture of old gasoline and recent occupation. Gideon let his eyes adjust before sweeping the room. What had once been storage for fuel drums and repair tools had been turned into a holding place. Not permanent, temporary, efficient. The kind of space meant to keep a person alive just long enough to be moved again. Against one wall stood 3 cases of bottled water, 2 open. Nearby were vacuum-sealed food packs, cheap canned soup, disposable plastic spoons, and a folding camp stove. A crate in the corner held gauze rolls, antiseptic wipes, athletic tape, and a half-used bottle of children's fever medicine. Zip ties lay in a coffee tin beside a coil of nylon rope. A thin gray blanket had been wadded up on top of flattened cardboard. Gideon crouched beside it. One edge of the blanket was stained with lake mud and what might have been juice or diluted blood. On the cardboard beneath it were pencil marks, the kind made by a bored or frightened hand trying to give shape to passing time. Lines, boxes, a crooked fish, A boat that looked like a child's idea of one. And then, on the largest piece, the drawing that stopped him cold. A big dog standing broadside. A child behind it. No background. No color. Just the dog like a wall. Rook came up beside him and lowered his nose to the drawing. His ears tilted forward. He did not sniff frantically. He stood in stillness, studying the rough pencil shape as if recognizing the intention mattered more than the smell. Gideon stared at the image longer than he meant to. Milo had been here. Milo had been scared enough, lonely enough, to draw protection before it arrived. Somehow, before Gideon understood he had been pulled into this, the boy had already made a place in his mind for the dog. It made the room feel smaller, more intimate, less like evidence and more like a promise delayed. He rose slowly and searched the rest of the shed. There were no electronics in plain sight. No clothing except a child's sock crushed beneath a shelf. No obvious blood. Whoever had used the place knew how to clear surfaces without making them clean. But there were mistakes, too. A boot print in dried mud near the back wall, cigarette ash by a window crack, one energy bar wrapper tucked beneath a nail keg. Rook moved toward a section of the floor where an old interior partition had once stood. He pawed once at the boards, then looked back. Gideon found a loose panel behind stacked fuel cans. The space beyond was narrow, just enough for a person to crouch in darkness. The smell there was unmistakable. Child, fear, damp wool, and the stale plastic of a cheap raincoat. Milo had hidden there at least once, or been shoved there. Gideon shut his eyes for a moment. It was always the small signs that did the deepest damage. Not the ropes, not the shelter. The hidden space a child had tried to make survivable. Outside, a bird burst from the brush with a clatter of wings. Gideon turned instantly, pulse spiking in the old trained rhythm. Rook was already at the doorway, body rigid. They moved around the rear of the shed together, keeping close to the wall. Beyond it, the island opened into a strip of flattened grass and a half-collapsed loading platform. There, near the remains of an overturned handcart, a man tried to rise from a crouch and run. He made it 3 steps. Rook hit him at the knees like a silent impact of muscle and bone. The man went down hard with a choked yell, face first into the damp ground. Gideon was on him a second later, wrenching one arm up between the shoulder blades and pinning him with a forearm across the neck. The man was local. Gideon recognized him after a second through the mud and panic. Kurt Deller. Kurt was somewhere in his mid-30s, though meth, cheap liquor, and bad luck had carved another decade into his face. He was wiry rather than strong, with stringy blonde hair plastered to his skull, bad skin, a patchwork beard, and eyes that darted too quickly to ever look innocent, even when he was. Men like Kurt existed around every harbor town, sometimes hauling scrap, sometimes transporting bait, sometimes making cash by agreeing not to ask questions. Petty enough to be useful, weak enough to be disposable. "Don't let that dog bite me," Kurt rasped, voice shaking. "Jesus, Gideon, get him off." "Then stop moving." Rook backed off on command but stayed close, head low, eyes fixed on Kurt's throat. The dog's lips were closed. No growl. That frightened men more than noise ever did. "What are you doing here?" Gideon asked. Kurt swallowed mud and saliva. "I'm just watching the place." "For who?" "I don't know." Gideon twisted the captured wrist 1 inch higher. Kurt gasped. "I swear. I don't know names." "Try harder." The man shuddered and went still. Rainwater from old leaves dripped somewhere in the dark. The lake tapped softly at the ruined dock below them. "He contacted me on radio," Kurt said. "Told me there'd be supply drops. Told me to keep people away. Make noise if boats came near. That's all." "The boy?" Kurt looked away too quickly. Gideon pressed harder. "The kid was already here when I got brought in," Kurt blurted. "I never touched him. I brought food twice, maybe 3 times. He cried a lot at first. Then he quit. That was worse." "Who told you not to let him talk?" Kurt licked cracked lips. "A guy with a ring, silver ring, anchor on it, only the anchor was split in the middle, like it had been cut. He wore gloves first time, not second. Military type. Didn't talk much." The ring, the boat, the efficiency. Gideon felt old instincts tightening into pattern. "Why take the boy?" "I didn't ask." "You should have." Kurt laughed once, a dry, ugly sound. "You think people like me get paid to be curious?" Gideon said nothing. Kurt's breathing became faster, shallower. Fear was loosening him now. He kept glancing toward the tree line east of the platform, not because he expected rescue, but because he feared being overheard. "What else?" Gideon asked. Kurt shook his head. Rook took one step forward. Kurt flinched. All right. I heard a name once, that's it." "What name?" He hesitated. Moonlight caught the sweat on his face. Gideon saw, with a clarity that came too late, that Kurt was not only scared of Gideon or the dog. He was scared of speaking something aloud, as if names themselves could summon consequence. "Firebreak," he whispered. The word hit Gideon like cold iron under the ribs. For an instant the island blurred at the edges. Firebreak was not a dockside smuggling nickname. It was older than Birch Harbor, older than this boy, older than Gideon's attempt to become a man who repaired engines and minded his own business. A code name from a black operation 12 years gone. An operation he had been told not to remember in detail because official detail did not exist. He had provided long-range overwatch during a desert extraction. Broken convoy, dust storm, improvised routes. No questions. He had done his job, watched moving figures through scope glass, trusted the command net, and spent the years since wondering what exactly had been carried out under that cover besides wounded men. Firebreak. No one in Birch Harbor should have known that word. Rook's head snapped sideways, not toward the lake, toward the eastern scrub. He did not bark. He did not bare teeth. He simply turned in one abrupt motion and stared into darkness with such complete focus that Gideon felt the world narrow around that line of sight. Then the dog backed one step, just one, and pressed his flank against Gideon's leg. It was the oldest warning Rook gave. Not attack. Not move. Down. Gideon shoved Kurt flat and dropped with him. The shot cracked through the night half a second later. Kurt jerked under Gideon's arm. Something hot sprayed across Gideon's sleeve. For one confused heartbeat, he thought the bullet had missed. Then Kurt made a wet, bubbling sound that no living throat should make. Blood surged dark from the side of his neck. Damn it! A second shot slammed into the timber post behind Gideon, showering splinters over his shoulder. He dragged himself sideways, pulling Kurt by the jacket out of reflex more than hope, and rolled behind the collapsed handcart as Rook stayed low beside him, every muscle taut, eyes fixed east. Through a seam between rotted boards, Gideon caught the briefest wink of reflected light. Scope glass, withdrawing. Professional. Not a drunk with a deer rifle. Not a local fool panicking. Someone trained to fire once for certainty and once for cleanup. Kurt clawed weakly at Gideon's sleeve. Blood foamed at his lips. "Who is it?" Gideon hissed. Kurt's pupils were already widening. The wound was catastrophic. He knew it. Gideon knew it. There was no field fix for a neck hit like that in the dark, with a shooter still watching. Kurt tried to swallow and failed. He forced out a few words in pieces. "Don't let the dog..." Another convulsive breath. "Smell the chapel." Then his fingers loosened. His body sagged. Gideon held position another full minute, listening for brush movement, engine noise, footsteps, anything. Nothing came. Whoever had taken the shot had either already exfiltrated or been far enough not to care whether the island was searched after. When at last Gideon moved, it was with the bitter awareness that the island had given him exactly what it was meant to give. Proof Milo had been held here, a dead disposable witness, and one poisoned fragment of a clue. The chapel. He searched Kurt's pockets quickly. Cash. 2 cigarette butts in folded paper. A cheap folding knife. No phone. No extra radio. No ID beyond what any local would already know. A man emptied of all useful context before he was sent to stand watch. Rook ranged a few yards toward the eastern brush, then stopped and returned. The dog's restraint told Gideon more than pursuit would have. The shooter was gone. The scent was there, but old by the second, scattered by wind and reeds and distance. They left the island deeper into night than Gideon had intended. The ride back was rougher, not from weather. The lake remained dark and flat, but from the pressure in Gideon's chest that came whenever past and present touched too closely. Firebreak, chapel, ring, a trained marksman in Birch Harbor. None of it could be folded back into ordinary life now. He reached home just before dawn. The ridge above the lake was washed in that colorless hour before sunrise, when the world looked unfinished. Gideon killed the engine, tied off the skiff, and climbed to the cabin with Rook moving half a step ahead. The dog halted before the porch, not alert in the way he had been on the island. This was different. He stood very still, nose lifted, hackles rising one hair at a time along his back. Gideon saw it then. The front door stood closed, but not the way he had left it. The latch sat wrong by less than an inch. To most people it would have meant nothing. To Gideon it rang louder than broken glass. He drew his pistol and entered sideways. No overturned furniture. No smashed drawers. No obvious search. The cabin air smelled faintly of wet wool, old antiseptic, and a stranger's presence that had passed through quickly and with confidence. On the floor in the center of the room sat a metal field medical box. Olive drab, military issue, old enough to have crossed oceans. Gideon knew that kind of box, knew the hinge design, the latch pressure, the way medics packed them. His stomach tightened before he even knelt. Rook did not approach. He circled once, then stopped behind Gideon, gaze fixed on the box, as though it might open itself. Gideon lifted the lid. Inside, resting on a folded strip of scorched cloth, lay a single dog tag, blackened at one edge by old fire. The name punched through him harder than the gunfire had. Silas had been recon. Fast, quiet, sharper than most men deserved to be. A face cut from angles, eyes that missed little, humor so dry it barely counted as kindness. He had saved Gideon's life once in a ravine outside Lashkar Gah, by spotting a tripwire seconds before Gideon's boot hit it. 3 months later, firebreak happened. A vehicle burned, 2 bodies beyond recognition. One of them, Gideon had been told, was Silas. He had believed it because the alternative had never been offered. Now the tag sat in his house, warm from recent handling. Gideon did not realize he had stopped breathing until Rook gave a low sound behind him. The dog finally stepped close enough to sniff the metal. The reaction was immediate. Rook jerked back, hackles fully raised, lips parting without sound. Then he looked at Gideon, not with confusion, but with the sharp intensity he had shown at the dock, at the orchard, on the island. The scent on the tag was fresh, not memory, not history. A message had been delivered into Gideon's home by someone who either knew Silas Wren or was Silas Wren. Outside, dawn began to thin the dark over Birch Harbor. Inside the cabin, the past set one boot across the threshold and invited itself in. Birch Harbor woke beneath a sky so bright it felt almost indecent. The lake glittered as if it had never held fear. Men on ladders kept hanging festival lanterns along the waterfront. The bakery on Harbor Street pushed out the smell of cinnamon and warm crust. Children rode bicycles past the bandstand frame going up near the shore, their laughter thin and careless in the morning light. The town had decided, as towns often did, that routine was a form of courage. Gideon Vale knew better. Routine was also camouflage. He stood at the sink in his cabin with the burned dog tag on the counter beside him, sunlight touching the blackened edge of the metal. Silas Wren. The name lay there like an accusation with a pulse. He had slept perhaps an hour after returning from Alder Slip. Not deeply, not enough. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Kurt Deller's widening pupils and that tag waiting in the center of the room, as if the past had learned how to knock without sound. Rook lay near the door, not resting so much as maintaining a posture that resembled rest. The German shepherd's yellow-black coat caught strips of light across his back, his black saddle dark as wet bark. His ears twitched at every passing truck on the road below the ridge. Since dawn, he had risen twice to sniff the dog tag from a distance, then returned to his place without touching it again. Whatever scent clung to the metal had unsettled him in a way Gideon had never seen before. Gideon slipped the tag into an old canvas pouch, holstered his pistol beneath his shirt, and headed into town. He did not go to the sheriff. He met Owen Mercer behind the hardware store, where stacks of bagged soil and rusting tomato cages gave them a half-decent excuse to stand and talk. Owen still looked like he had not slept. His deputy uniform sat crooked at the collar, and the strain around his eyes made him seem younger and more worn at the same time. He was the sort of man whose decency had not yet hardened into cynicism, and that made him useful, but also vulnerable. "You look like hell," Owen said quietly. "I've looked worse." "That's not a denial." Gideon handed him the note with the words Alder Slip copied in his own block handwriting, along with a rough list of what he had found there. Food stores, restraints, signs of Milo, Kurt Deller dead from a long shot. Not everything. Not the dog tag. Not firebreak. Not yet. Owen read it and went pale beneath his sun-browned skin. Kells never mentioned Kurt missing. Not once. Would he? Owen folded the note into his pocket. He glanced toward the street where townspeople moved between errands and worry. There are things he kills on paper. Old dock complaints, fuel permits, weird calls about night traffic on the lake. Every time a file edges too close to the old freight properties north of town, it slows down or vanishes. Old freight properties? Owen nodded. Cold storage, rail lots, fuel sheds. Most of them haven't been active in years, on paper. That was enough to send Gideon where he already suspected he needed to go. The library. Birch Harbor Public Library sat 2 blocks uphill from the main square in a stone building that looked more permanent than anything else in town. Inside, it smelled of polished wood, paper, and radiator heat, no matter the season. Evelyn Sloan ruled the place with the quiet authority of a woman who never raised her voice because her memory did the work of force for her. Evelyn was 64 and narrow as a reed, with silver hair cut at the jawline and tucked neatly behind one ear. Her face was fine-boned and lined not with softness but with concentration earned over decades of paying attention. She wore a pale gray cardigan over a cream blouse, a dark skirt, and glasses on a chain that she only used when she wanted people to understand she was looking very closely. There was elegance to her, but not vanity. She seemed less like a librarian than a guardian appointed by time itself. She looked up as Gideon entered with Rook at his side. "I had a feeling you would come before lunch," she said. "Why?" "Because troubled men always arrive before noon. By afternoon, they begin lying to themselves about being tired." Gideon almost smiled. Evelyn's gaze dipped to Rook. "And because your dog looks like he has decided he's no longer willing to be patient with the rest of us." Within 20 minutes, they were in the records room in the basement, where rolled survey maps leaned in cylinders and deed ledgers sat in labeled shelves older than Gideon's service record. Dust lived there, thick as memory. Evelyn moved among the cabinets without hesitation, slender fingers tracing labels, pulling files that seemed unrelated until they formed a shape. She found it first. A faded facilities survey from 14 years ago showing a disused cold storage warehouse near the abandoned rail spur north of town. Scribbled in one corner, nearly erased by time and copied layers, was a triangular mark crossed by 3 slashes. Gideon's stomach tightened. "That symbol," Evelyn murmured, adjusting her glasses. "I thought I'd seen it before. Only once. On a duplicate logistics map that was requested and never returned. Winter, 2018. Man with a county office signature." "Which office?" She looked over the rim of her glasses. "That is the interesting part." The warehouse records were held through shell entities, companies with names so generic they felt assembled by bored accountants. But several permit renewals, zoning exceptions, and deferred tax notices had been approved years earlier by a council committee on which Harlan Pike had served before becoming mayor. Not proof, but too much shadow under one door. Gideon studied the papers in silence. Pike's face rose in his mind again. The polished concern, the easy phrasing, the kind of smile that had probably won him 3 elections and 1,000 secrets. Evil rarely looked theatrical. More often, it looked civic. Evelyn slid another folder across the table. "You may also want this." Inside was an old clipping about a closed fuel transport route across the lake, linked to municipal offloading points and one white chapel on a narrow peninsula that had later become a wedding site. "The chapel," Gideon said. Evelyn heard the change in his voice. "So that is not a random word." Before he could answer, Rook rose from beside the table and padded to the bottom of the basement stairs. He stood there, listening upward. Evelyn noticed. "He hears more than the rest of us." "He usually does." "Then I suggest we don't keep him waiting." By mid-afternoon, Gideon drove out to the white chapel with Rook in the truck and the old papers on the seat beside him. The chapel stood on a narrow tongue of land that reached into the lake, its white paint weathered but still bright. its little steeple lifted against the sky like a finger asking for silence. Weddings were held there in summer, memorials in winter. It was the sort of place people brought flowers, vows, and grief because water made all three look holier. Reverend Asa Bell was trimming dead stems from the hydrangea beds when Gideon arrived. Asa was 67, tall but bent slightly through the shoulders, as though the years had rested there and simply never moved on. His white hair was thin and combed back. His face, all narrow lines and kind bones, had the weathered dignity of driftwood that had chosen not to break. He wore a black coat over a clerical collar despite the mild day, and his hands, though knotted with age, moved carefully among the stems. His voice, when he greeted Gideon, had the dry texture of sanded wood. "I thought it might be you," he said, "or the boy from the sheriff's office, but not the mayor. That told me enough already." Gideon stepped out of the truck. "You know why I'm here? I know why a man with war in his eyes comes to a chapel by the lake instead of a church in town." That was not an answer, but it was close enough. Inside, the chapel smelled of beeswax, pine cleaner, and lake air drifting through cracked windows. Sunlight poured across the pews in pale bars. Asa led Gideon not to the altar, but to a back room lined with hymnals, donation boxes, and old folded chairs. From a cabinet drawer, he removed a sealed envelope yellowed at the corners. "This was left with me years ago," he said, "by a veteran who said he might not live long enough to return. He told me to open it only if one word ever came back to Birch Harbor." Asa's gaze settled on Gideon. "Firebreak." Gideon did not ask how the old man knew that was the word. He had already learned enough in the last 48 hours to stop expecting coincidence. Inside the envelope was a small brass key, an old photograph, and a note written in tight, controlled script. "If the dog leads you to the lake, trust the dog, not the badge." Gideon read it twice. Then he looked at the photograph. It showed the cold storage warehouse from years earlier, younger and less decayed, with a truck backed to the loading dock. 3 men stood in partial frame. One was younger but recognizable, Harlan Pike, before the silver at his temples, still carrying the same polished posture. Another stood mostly in shadow. On his hand, caught by the flash, was a silver ring in the shape of a broken anchor. The third man had been scratched over so violently the paper was nearly torn. "Who left this?" Gideon asked. Asa took longer than necessary to answer. "A man called Nolan Pierce." It was the first time Gideon had heard the name. "He was Navy?" "Logistics, I believe. Tall fellow. Wore caution the way some men wear cologne." Asa's mouth bent slightly, not quite a smile. "Never sat with his back to a door. He came here 3 times over 2 winters. The last time he looked like he had buried something alive." "Why trust you?" "Because pastors hear confessions from people who don't use the word confess." Rook, who had been lying near the threshold in patient silence, rose and walked toward the chapel's side window. He did not bristle. He did not growl. He simply stood with one forepaw lifted, staring past the flower beds to the lake beyond. Gideon crossed to the glass. Far out on the water, just past the line where wedding boats usually anchored, a single skiff rested motionless in the late light. Too far to identify, too still to be fishing. It sat at a distance that could almost be called accidental. Almost. Rook's tail did not stiffen. His ears stayed forward, curious rather than alarmed. Asa came to stand behind Gideon. "That boat has been appearing off and on for a week," he said. "Never close enough for rudeness, never far enough for innocence. You tell anyone?" "Who would I tell? The men with badges, or the men who buy stained glass repairs?" Gideon watched the skiff until it drifted 1 degree west with the current. For the first time since finding Milo's trace, he felt the presence of another player who was neither bumbling local nor immediate enemy. Someone careful, someone watching the board, not just the piece in front of him. Rook gave one soft exhale at the glass. Not warning. Recognition. By the time Gideon stepped outside, the skiff had started moving, slow and unhurried, leaving hardly any wake. It did not come nearer. It did not flee. It simply altered its angle and vanished beyond the glare. The moment passed, but not the feeling it left behind. Back inside, Gideon folded the note and photograph into his pocket. "There's more under this town than anyone's saying." Asa gave a tired nod. "There usually is. Towns are like families. They survive by remembering what flatters them and misplacing the rest." On the drive back, Birch Harbor looked unchanged. The square bustled, ice cream windows opened, teenagers carried folding chairs toward the festival stage. Pike himself stood near the waterfront with his sleeves rolled neatly, helping string lantern wire while chatting with volunteers as if civic grace were muscle memory. Gideon slowed at the light and watched him. Pike turned at that exact moment. Their eyes met across the street. The mayor lifted a hand in the easy, neighborly gesture of a man with nothing to fear. Gideon did not wave back. That evening he returned to the cabin and spread the photograph, note, zoning files, and the brass key across his kitchen table. Rook circled once beneath the window, then settled in a spot facing the lake instead of the door. It was a small thing, but Gideon had lived too long by small things to ignore it. He poured coffee and stared at the evidence until the room dimmed around him. Pike's name threaded through old permissions. Kells had been suppressing or slowing anything that touched the freight routes. Kurt Deller's dying warning had pointed to the chapel. Nolan Pierce had anticipated the dog. And somewhere inside that knot, Silas Wren's name had returned from the dead like a hand pushing up through shallow dirt. Gideon took the dog tag from its pouch and set it beside the photograph. The two objects did not belong in the same peaceful northern town, yet here they were, lying on his scarred wooden table while crickets started up outside, and the lake reflected the first evening stars. He had the shape of a pattern now, but not the center of it. Not yet. Out on the water below the ridge, a small light appeared briefly and then went out. Rook lifted his head. Gideon did the same. He understood then that Birch Harbor had not merely hidden something old. It had been built around the hiding. The smiling streets, the festival plans, the white chapel, the elected hands and stamped permits, all of it might be the painted shell around a chamber left sealed too long. And someone beyond his sight was still moving inside those walls. The old cold storage warehouse stood north of Birch Harbor, where the abandoned rail spur cut through scrub and broken gravel, like a scar the town had let weeds inherit. In daylight, it looked harmless in the way ruins often did. Red brick gone dark with age. Upper windows punched through by weather and vandals. Rusted loading doors hanging half open like tired mouths. Grass had climbed the foundation, and young birch saplings had taken root near the cracked platform as if the land were trying to reclaim a place built for colder intentions. But Gideon knew better than to trust harmless silhouettes. Places used for hiding rarely advertised themselves with menace. They wore disuse like a coat and waited for people to look elsewhere. He parked the truck beyond the tree line just before sunset. The air smelled of hot grass, iron rails, and distant water. Rook was already standing in the bed of the truck before Gideon had even opened the tailgate, every line of the German shepherd's body drawn forward with hard concentration. His yellow and black coat rippled along the shoulders. His ears were upright, his amber-brown eyes fixed on the warehouse as if he had heard a voice too low for human hearing. Maribel stepped out of her own vehicle behind them, pulling the denim jacket tighter across her shoulders despite the warmth. In the slanting light, her chestnut hair looked almost copper at the edges, and the tired strength in her face seemed carved sharper than it had in the orchard. Fear had not made her fragile. It had made her deliberate. Owen Mercer came a moment later, trying to move like a calm deputy and failing just enough for Gideon to respect him more. The young officer's light eyes were too alert, his jaw set too tightly. He had removed his uniform shirt and thrown on a plain work jacket over the undershirt, but he still carried himself like law enforcement, straight-backed, prepared, painfully aware of the line he was stepping over. "You sure this is the place?" Owen asked. Gideon nodded once. "Too many roads lead here." Owen glanced at the building, then at the tree line behind them. "Kells thinks I'm checking the west cabins." "Then keep it that way." They spoke briefly, low and practical. Owen and Maribel would stay outside, one near the rail embankment, one covering the service road. No radios, phones on silent. If things went bad, Owen called for medical help only after Milo was clear. Gideon did not need to say why. They all understood by now that not every official response could be trusted. Rook gave a sudden, sharp pull on the leash. "Easy," Gideon whispered, unclipping it. The dog shot forward a few paces, then checked himself, turning back as if to make sure Gideon was coming. That mattered. Rook was not charging blindly. He was leading. They circled to the rear of the warehouse where an old employee entrance had been covered with corrugated metal and patched plywood. The plywood was new, too new. Gideon tested the hinge line with his fingers, found the weak point, and slipped inside. The air within Boone was colder than outside, though not from any active refrigeration. It was the kind of deep, stale cool left in buildings that had once been built to preserve flesh. Dust floated through slanting beams of light from broken windows. The warehouse smelled of mold, oil, wet concrete, and beneath it, something recent. Generator heat, human sweat, canned food, bleach. Someone had used this place often enough to change its breath. Rook moved ahead, paws nearly soundless on the concrete, nose sweeping low. Gideon followed past rows of rusted shelving and stacked pallets, past an old loading scale and broken forklift tines. There were fresh cable runs tacked along one wall. A portable generator hummed somewhere deeper inside. On a folding table lay bottled water, opened tins, a trauma kit, and two battery-powered security cameras feeding to a small monitor. The cameras were live. Not desperate kidnappers, then. Organized ones. At the far end of the main room, a temporary chamber had been built out of insulated paneling and soundproofing foam, crude but effective. The sort of thing someone could assemble quickly if they understood confinement. Gideon heard it then. A faint scrape from inside, weak and irregular, like a shoe dragging against the floor. He went to the latch. Rook stood so close to his leg Gideon could feel the heat coming off him. Gideon opened the door. Milo Brennan was inside. The boy looked smaller than 11 when fear had wrung him dry. He was hunched on a narrow cot, wrists zip-tied in front of him, his navy hoodie stained at the sleeves and knees. His brown hair stuck in damp angles to his forehead, and his face, usually bright and curious from the few times Gideon had seen him in town, had gone pale beneath freckles and dirt. But his eyes were open, and when they landed on Rook, something inside him broke free. The sound he made was not quite a sob. It was the sound of belief arriving too late and still being enough. Rook stepped forward slowly, tail low, head gentle, and pressed close without touching until Milo reached for him with bound hands. Then the dog leaned in, solid and warm and real. "It's okay," Gideon said, kneeling. "You're coming out." Milo's lips trembled. "I knew he'd come back." Gideon cut the zip ties and checked the boy quickly. No obvious broken bones. Mild dehydration. Bruising at the wrists. A scrape on the jaw. Fear shock. He handed Milo water, watching carefully so he would not drink too fast. "Can you walk?" Milo nodded, then shook his head, then nodded again. "I think so." "What did they want?" The boy swallowed hard. "The card." "What card?" "The drone card. The memory card. I took it out after I saw the boat." Gideon kept his voice level. "What did you see on it?" Milo stared at the floor a second, gathering courage the way children do, without theatrics, without understanding how brave they are. A boat by the old ferry place. No lights. 2 men moving boxes. Then the drone dipped lower because the wind pushed it. One man looked up. "I know his face, I didn't want to say it where they could hear." "Did you hide the card?" Milo nodded. "Not in my room, somewhere else." "Did you tell anybody where?" "Tessa knows part of it. Not the whole thing." He looked up suddenly, fear flashing again. "They kept asking if I sent the video to anyone. I didn't. I swear." "I know." Milo looked at Rook once more and lowered his voice as if confessing to the dog rather than the man. "I saw him before. At the dock. That day I gave him sandwich meat. He looked like he understood stuff." Rook blinked, calm, patient, as though such responsibilities had always belonged to him. Then the lights went out. The generator hum died, plunging the warehouse into a silence so complete it felt staged. A second later, the outer steel door slammed somewhere in the darkness with the hard, deliberate finality of a trap being sprung. Milo gasped. Rook wheeled toward the corridor, every hair along his shoulders rising. From overhead, through a speaker Gideon had not noticed tucked into the corner, a voice drifted down, low, composed, and familiar in the way nightmares are familiar before you wake enough to name them. "You never learned when to stop pulling threads, Gideon." The voice had aged, but only at the edges. It still carried the dry, deliberate cadence of a man who wasted no word he had not already weighed. Silas Wren. For one suspended beat, Gideon did not move. He saw, not the dark chamber around him, but a younger man in desert camouflage with a narrow face, deep-set gray eyes, and a talent for disappearing into terrain even before he'd vanished from the official world. Silas had always been lean rather than bulky, all tendon and precision, dark hair clipped close, humor so thin it often arrived half a second after the insult. He had once dragged Gideon behind a blown-out wall under mortar fire and told him, with infuriating calm, that bleeding was an administrative problem, not a moral one. That man had been declared dead. Now his voice stood in the dark and proved how cheaply paper lied. "I'm not in the mood for ghosts," Gideon said. A soft crackle came over the speaker. "Then you should have stayed away from old names." Milo clutched at Rook's collar. The dog did not pull away. "You took a child," Gideon said. "I protected a system," Silas replied. "Children wander into systems all the time. Most don't film them." Gideon's jaw tightened. "Show yourself." "No." Not theatrical. Not taunting. Just practical. That was what made it worse. Silas continued, voice moving through hidden speakers with clinical calm. He admitted just enough to poison the room. After firebreak, he had staged his own death during the convoy explosion, stripped identity from the wreckage, and stepped off the official map with part of the cargo network intact. The lake towns, the depots, the shell firms, the quiet municipal permits. Birch Harbor was not the whole machine. Only one elegant gear in it. Safe because it looked gentle. Useful because nobody expected organized darkness to smell like pine and cherry pie. "Let the boy go," Gideon said. "He already knows too much." "You kept him alive this long." "Because I needed to know where the card was." The voice paused. "And whether you still followed dogs more readily than orders." Smoke touched the room then, faint at first. Not from fire already burning. From accelerant meeting-timed ignition somewhere close. Gideon saw Rook's head shift. The dog did not look at the door. He looked left, toward an unseen recess in the wall paneling where human scent had been strongest all along. "Down!" Gideon snapped to Milo. He shoved the boy toward the floor and turned just as Rook launched. The German shepherd hit the dark opening like a thrown spear. A man cursed. A gunshot exploded in the confined room, blinding bright for an instant. Milo screamed. Foam insulation caught fire with a hungry orange lick, and smoke rolled hard across the ceiling. "Move!" Gideon shouted. He kicked the side panel where a vent grill had been bolted over a service crawl space. It tore loose on the second strike. Small, ugly, but enough. Owen was already at the other side, having heard the shot. "Gideon! Take him!" Milo crawled through coughing, and Owen dragged him clear with both hands, not as a deputy then, but as a man hauling a child back into the world. Maribel appeared out of the smoke at the corridor entrance. Her face gray with fear, but set with ferocious intent. She had grabbed a fire extinguisher from somewhere in the outer room and blasted white powder toward the spreading flames to buy seconds, not salvation. "Where's Rook?" she yelled. As if in answer, the dog burst from the haze, shoulders blackened with soot, teeth clamped on something metallic. Behind him, a figure moved through the smoke. Lean, fast, one hand pressed to the other wrist where blood darkened the sleeve. Gideon caught only fragments. The narrow outline of a face. The clean efficiency of motion. The old violence of someone trained never to waste it. Not enough to fully see. Enough to know. Silas was there. Gideon lunged, but a second burst of flame forced him back. The man vanished through a side loading passage, swallowed by smoke and failing light. Rook skidded to Gideon's boots and dropped what he had carried. A silver ring spun once on the concrete and settled. Broken anchor. For a second, the warehouse held all its truths in one image. The burning foam, the choking air, the child saved by inches, the ring dragged from a fleeing hand, and the shape of a dead man who had never truly died. They got outside in waves of coughing and heat. Owen half-carried Milo to the grass beyond the rail embankment. Maribel dropped beside them, one hand shaking as she checked the boy's forehead, the other still white-knuckled around the empty extinguisher. Gideon came last with Rook tight against his leg, both of them streaked with smoke. Sirens would come soon, too soon. The fire was already climbing inside the warehouse, chewing through whatever traces had not been meant to survive. Milo sagged against Owen's arm, eyes glassy but conscious. "Stay with me," Owen said, voice rough. The boy nodded weakly. Then he turned toward Gideon, as if remembering one last necessary thing. "He said," Milo whispered. Gideon crouched close. "He said you'd go to the chapel too late." A cold thread pulled through Gideon's spine. "What's under the chapel, Milo?" Milo swallowed, fighting the dark that kept trying to take him. He said, "Find it first. Under the white chapel. Before you do." Then the last of his strength gave way. His head lolled against Owen's shoulder, not dead, only gone into the exhausted blankness of a body that had run out of fear to burn. Gideon looked at the ring in his hand, then toward the invisible line of lake beyond the trees. This was no longer a story of old names clawing back into daylight. It was a hunt happening now. And somewhere beneath the brightest place in Birch Harbor, something waited to be found. The white chapel stood over Birch Harbor, like a promise people preferred to believe. In summer, brides walked up its narrow path in satin and trembling laughter. Photographers loved the way the lake behind it gathered sunlight, until the whole place looked dipped in mercy. In winter, families came there in dark coats to speak softly over flowers and folded flags. The chapel had served every version of hope the town knew how to wear. That was what made it the perfect place to bury something unforgivable. Gideon arrived just after dawn with Rook in the passenger seat, and the broken anchor ring wrapped in a handkerchief inside his jacket pocket. The sky was pale gold. The lake lay almost perfectly still, reflecting the chapel's white siding with such gentleness that it felt obscene. He had slept less than 2 hours after the fire at the warehouse. Milo was alive, stable enough to be kept quiet for the moment under Owen's protection and Maribel's practical care, but the words he had whispered before passing out had not loosened their grip on Gideon's mind. Maribel's truck was already parked in the gravel lane when Gideon stepped out. She stood near the hydrangea beds with both hands jammed into the pockets of her faded denim jacket, hair tied back but already half freed by the lake breeze. She looked tired in the frank, honest way people looked after nights that had stripped them down to action and fear. Yet there was no wavering in her. Her amber-brown eyes met Gideon's once, long enough to confirm they were both too deep in this to pretend otherwise. Owen arrived a minute later, driving too carefully for a man his age and too tensely for a man at peace with himself. He had traded his deputy uniform for dark work clothes, but authority still clung awkwardly to him, especially now that he was betraying some part of the institution he had once wanted to trust. The moral strain showed in the tightness around his mouth. Reverend Asa Bell came out of the chapel, carrying the brass key. The old minister's black coat hung from his tall, slightly stooped frame like something that had weathered decades with him. His white hair lay thin and swept back, his lined face composed, but not calm. Men like Asa did not scare easily, but they did understand when fear had become reasonable. "I hoped I was wrong," he said, holding up the key, "but hoping has never fixed a lock." He led them through the side entrance, past polished pews and a little altar bright with fresh flowers left by someone planning a wedding for next month. That contrast worked on Gideon like a pressure point. Above them, stained glass washed the floor in soft color. Beneath them, if Milo and the dead and the frightened were right, there was rot. The entrance to the lower chamber had been hidden well. Under a threadbare runner behind the vestry, Asa knelt with a grunt, lifted a trap set flush into the floorboards, and exposed a square iron hatch. Rust had gathered along its edges, but the key still turned after a little force. Cold air rose from below. The stairway was narrow, stone-lined, and much older than the chapel itself. The deeper they went, the more the scent changed, from beeswax and lake air to dust, damp lime, and the long-sealed breath of forgotten rooms. Rook went first, slow and controlled, his yellow-black body tense but not alarmed. He paused at the bottom and looked back once, as if marking the threshold. The chamber beneath the chapel was larger than Gideon expected. At first glance, it resembled an old Prohibition-era cellar. Stone walls, crated shelves, heavy beams, and drain channels cut into the floor. But then the newer modifications revealed themselves. Electrical conduit added decades later, filing cabinets bolted to one side, a reinforced inner door, and a steel safe tucked behind what had once been a rack of sacramental storage. "This was never only a basement," Owen murmured. "No," Gideon said. "It was a handoff point." Maribel ran her fingers over a wooden crate stamped with a faded freight code. "So the lake gave things to the town," she said quietly, "and the town passed them on." Asa's face tightened with grief that looked older than the morning. "Sometimes I think communities do not fall all at once. They just make one compromise at a time until the lie becomes architecture." The safe opened with the brass key and a secondary dial Gideon cracked by touch and patience. Inside were 4 things: a rugged external hard drive sealed in plastic, 2 thick envelopes of shipping records and old photographs, a bundle of manifests clipped with corroded brass, and 1 mini DV tape marked only with black grease pencil. Gideon felt something tighten beneath his sternum. They carried the material upstairs to a small meeting room beside the chapel office where Asa kept an old television monitor, a dusty camcorder deck used long ago for church events, and a laptop slow enough to feel historical. Owen shut the curtains. Maribel stood by the door. Rook lay near Gideon's boots, watching all of them with the grave attention he reserved for rooms where voices mattered. The tape took longer than Gideon wanted to load. The machine whirred, coughed, then accepted it. The image that came up was grainy, sun-blasted, and unstable with age. Desert. A convoy route. Voices over military comms. Gideon knew the light before he knew the place. Afghan light had a way of bleaching mercy out of everything. He saw trucks moving through heat shimmer, heard men speaking in clipped operational language, watched timestamp code jitter in the corner. Then the footage shifted to an offloading point hidden behind what looked like a damaged aid depot. Crates were moved under tarps. Serial markings were covered. One camera angle caught a young Harlan Pike, thinner, harder, not yet polished by small-town politics, standing beside a clipboard and speaking to a man just off frame. The image cut, returned, then caught Silas Wren in profile. Younger, lean as wire, hair close-cropped, face all planes and shadows. Alive, efficient. One hand lifted in signal. No smile, no uncertainty. Maribel let out a small, disbelieving breath. Owen swore softly. The tape rolled on. What Firebreak had been presented as in briefings, a recovery and emergency rerouting operation under hostile conditions, now revealed itself as something filthier. Military materiel and illicit inventory had been redirected through unofficial channels, washed through civilian shipping fronts, and sent toward routes designed to disappear them into domestic systems. Not just theft. Laundering through legitimacy. Then the footage shifted to a distant Overwatch angle. A ridge. A scope view. A call sign Gideon had not heard in 12 years. His own. He saw himself only for a second, when another camera panned wide enough to catch the sniper position change after a dust burst. Just a lean figure in tactical gear on high ground, doing exactly what he had been ordered to do, covering the movement, protecting the route, believing he was securing wounded extraction under partial blackout conditions. The room went still around him. There it was. Not proof that he had designed the crime, not proof that he had even understood it then, but proof that he had been part of the machine. A clean piece of force shielding dirty logistics, enough to split the story he had told himself from the story the tape insisted on. Gideon sat back slowly. For a long moment nobody spoke. Rook rose and came to stand against his leg, silent and steady. Gideon put one hand on the dog's neck without looking down. The warmth there kept him from drifting into the blank place guilt often opened inside a man. Rook did not comfort in the human way. He anchored. There was a difference. Maribel was the first to speak. "You didn't know." Gideon kept his eyes on the frozen screen. Not knowing doesn't erase function. "No," Asa said gently from across the table. "But it does define sin differently from intention." Owen looked at Gideon with the raw discomfort of someone watching another man's moral wound open in real time. "You were used." Gideon almost laughed, but there was no humor in him. "That's one way to phrase it." Rook's head lifted, not sharply, not like warning fire. He turned toward the chapel door and stood with still, focused expectation, ears forward, body balanced, not defensive, not aggressive, waiting. Gideon saw it a heartbeat before anyone else. The dog was not reacting to the men already in the room. He was reacting to a presence just beyond it. Then came the soft creak of a floorboard in the hall overhead. No one had heard the outer door open. Owen went for the pistol at the back of his waistband. Maribel took one step away from the curtains. Asa straightened despite the stiffness in his spine. The second sound was unmistakable, a measured bootstep descending the side staircase. Rook did not growl. He simply stood there as if recognizing something unresolved. The door opened. Sheriff Dorian Kells entered first with his sidearm drawn, flanked by two men Gideon had never seen in Birch Harbor, but recognized at once for what they were: private muscle disguised as local contractors. One was tall and slab-faced with a shaved head and a reddish beard trimmed too close to hide the scar under his chin. The other was shorter, broad through the shoulders, Latino or native perhaps, with flat eyes and the heavy calm of someone who had long ago made peace with hired violence. Both wore work jackets over tactical holsters. Neither looked surprised to find a basement under the chapel. Kells looked old suddenly. Older than his 52 years. Older than his badge. His sheriff's posture had gone stiff with the strain of a man trying to perform authority over the top of personal ruin. "Step away from the table," he said. Owen turned. "Sheriff, not one more word, deputy." The tone carried not command alone, but pleading buried under command, as though Kells knew that if Owen made him say certain things aloud, there would be no way back into the person he had once thought himself to be. Gideon stood slowly. "You had us watched." Kells swallowed once. "I had the chapel checked after the fire. There are too many loose ends now." Maribel's voice was hard as flint. "So you brought mercenaries into a church?" Kells did not look at her. His eyes stayed on Gideon, and the evidence spread across the table. "I'm not here for speeches," he said. "Give me the drive, the tape, the paperwork, all of it." "Why?" Owen demanded. "So Pike can burn the rest?" That landed. A visible flinch crossed Kells's face, not because the name was wrong, but because it had been spoken too directly in front of the wrong witnesses. One of the hired men shifted his stance. The shorter one kept his weapon low but ready. The red-bearded one looked bored, which made him more dangerous, not less. Gideon watched Kells carefully. He saw then what he had only suspected before. This was not a man born rotten. This was a man worn into rot by installments. Fear, debt, compromise, gratitude weaponized until it curdled into obedience. "Pike paid for your daughter's treatment," Gideon said quietly. Kells's jaw hardened. "There it is," Gideon went on. "That's how he brought you in." For a second, the sheriff's face cracked open enough to show the exhausted father under the uniform. "You think you know anything?" he snapped. "You think good men don't drown 1 inch at a time? My little girl was dying. Insurance had run dry. The town talked prayers and charity dinners. Pike wrote checks, quietly. No cameras, no speeches. And then he owned you," Gideon said. Kells's silence answered better than denial would have. Owen looked stricken. Not shocked, exactly. More like a son hearing the secret weakness of a father he had wanted to respect. "That doesn't excuse this," Owen said hoarsely. "No," Kells replied. "It doesn't." The admission hung there, terrible in its honesty. "But it explains it," he added. "And right now explanation is all I've got left." He lifted his weapon higher. "Give me the evidence." Gideon did not move toward the table. Neither did Rook. The dog stood beside him, eyes no longer on Kells, but on the open doorway behind the sheriff. Again, that same uncanny stillness had returned. Not threat, not fear, but expectation sharpened to a point, as if someone else was already here. And this time, instead of bracing for violence, Rook simply waited. The room beneath the white chapel held its breath. Sheriff Dorian Kells stood in the doorway with his gun raised. The two hired men beside him like blunt instruments shaped into human form. The red-bearded one had shoulders like a loading dock, and the bored expression of a man who had spent too many years taking orders from worse men than himself. The shorter one watched with flatter, colder eyes, his weight balanced slightly forward, the stance of someone who preferred quick violence over threats. But Rook was not looking at any of them. The German shepherd stood at Gideon's side with his body still and his ears angled toward the open doorway behind Kells, as though the real answer to the room had not entered yet. Gideon trusted that instinct more than he trusted badges, speeches, or official tone. And then the man appeared. He stepped into view without hurry, one hand lifted slightly away from his body, not in surrender, but to show he carried no weapon in it. He was in his late 50s, perhaps touching 60, tall and spare with the kind of strength age had thinned but not erased. His face was long and weather-cut, his jaw gray with a day's stubble, his nose slightly bent as if it had been broken once and set badly. His hair, once dark, had gone iron gray and was cropped close in a practical way that suggested vanity had long ago lost all jurisdiction over his life. He wore a canvas field jacket the color of smoke over a dark Henley, work pants, and old waterproof boots stained by mud and travel. Nothing about him was theatrical. Everything about him was controlled. His eyes settled first on Gideon, then on the evidence laid across the table, then finally on Rook. The dog did not growl. He took one step forward and stood there, calm as a witness recognizing the man called to testify next. "Nolan Pierce," Reverend Asa Bell said softly. The name altered the room. Kells jerked his head as if he had been struck by a word instead of a hand. One of the hired men half-turned, unsure whether to shift aim toward the newcomer. Owen looked from Nolan to Gideon to the tape on the table. An understanding dawned across his face in fragments rather than all at once. Nolan Pierce did not look like a savior. He looked like a man who had spent too many years surviving by caution and had only now decided survival without truth was not worth much. "I told you," Nolan said to Asa without taking his gaze from Kells. "If the dog found the path, the rest would follow." His voice carried the dry steadiness of someone long practiced at speaking only when speech mattered. It was not warm, but it was not cruel. It was a voice shaped by duty and regret, and by the private fatigue of a man who had been keeping one door shut with his shoulder for far too long. Kells's weapon trembled just enough for Gideon to notice. "You were supposed to be gone," the sheriff said. "I was," Nolan replied. "And look what happened while I was." That landed harder than an accusation shouted ever could have. Nolan reached slowly into the inside pocket of his jacket and withdrew a sealed envelope. Then another memory card in a clear plastic sleeve. He laid both on the nearest pew without asking permission from anyone in the room. "Supplemental records," he said. "Financial trails, transport scheduling, route confirmations, off-book municipal access. Enough to bury Pike under the life he built for himself." The name Pike moved through the chapel room like a crack through ice. As if summoned by it, footsteps sounded above them. No one turned at first. The truth was already here, and everyone in the room seemed to know that whatever came down the stairs now would no longer be wearing the comfort of disguise. Harlan Pike descended with one hand on the rail, still dressed as though the day might yet require a photograph. Blue shirt, tailored slacks, polished shoes that did not belong in cellar dust. Even now he carried himself with the easy, erect grace of a man accustomed to town halls, fundraisers, and sympathetic smiles. But the mask had changed. The warmth had gone out of it. His face, so often arranged for reassurance, was drawn tighter around the mouth, the eyes colder and sharper now that no crowd remained to charm. He did not look surprised to see Gideon. He looked irritated to see how far things had gotten. "Well," Pike said, glancing from Nolan to the tape to Kells, "this has become needlessly dramatic." Maribel gave a short laugh with no humor in it. "That's one way to describe child kidnapping, murder, and smuggling." Pike didn't even look at her. "I describe it as civic stability threatened by people who enjoy righteous fire more than practical outcomes." That was Harlan Pike in his purest form, a man who wrapped rot in careful language and expected others to admire the packaging. Nolan stepped fully into the room then, and for the first time Pike's expression shifted. Not fear, recognition. "You should have stayed dead in paperwork," Pike said. "I tried," Nolan replied. "You people are hard to ignore." The tension tightened. Gideon could feel it in the room like static before a storm. Not a coming battle exactly, but the final refusal of lies to stay sitting down. Kells's breathing had shortened. The hired men had grown too alert. Owen's hand hovered close to the weapon at his back. Maribel's eyes tracked everything, not with trained instinct, but with the fierce concentration of a woman who had already lost too much to stand still now. Rook remained where he was, quiet, balanced, watching not just the guns, but the hearts attached to them. Then Kells broke. It happened not in a grand gesture, but in a twitch of panic. Pike took one half-step backward. Nolan shifted his shoulder. Owen inhaled too sharply, and Kells, already hanging over the cliff edge of his own bad choices, jerked and fired. The shot cracked through the chapel room. Rook moved first. The dog launched upward with explosive force, not at Kells's throat, but into the sheriff's gun arm, striking high enough to wrench the muzzle aside. The bullet ripped past Gideon's left shoulder, grazing through fabric and skin in a burning line before smashing into the stone wall. Everything after that happened in fragments too fast for thought. Owen drove into the red-bearded gunman, slamming him sideways into a filing cabinet with a crash that sent folders and dust into the air. The shorter hired man swung toward Maribel, maybe assuming she was the weakest target. He was wrong. On the stand near the chapel side table rested a heavy brass candlestick used for ceremonial services. Maribel seized it with both hands and brought it down across the man's temple, with the full force of terror turned into action. The blow staggered him. She hit him again, sharper, lower. He collapsed against a chair and slid to the floor, groaning. Kells stumbled backward, fighting Rook's weight, and lost hold of the gun. It skidded across the stone. Gideon was already moving, not toward Kells but after Pike, because Pike had done what men like him always did when the machinery broke. He headed for the exit. They burst out of the chapel into hard morning light. The lake flashed white-blue behind the steps, so bright it hurt. Pike ran badly, not from age but from unfamiliarity with honest panic. He was not built for pursuit. He was built for negotiation, misdirection, leverage. Yet now all he had left were his own legs and the illusion that words could still save him. Gideon caught him at the top of the stone path leading down toward the water. Pike turned, chest heaving, one hand raised. "Listen to me," he said. "You have no idea what collapses if this goes public." Gideon stood a few feet away, one hand pressed briefly against the bleeding graze on his shoulder, the other empty but steady. Behind him, chapel bells stirred in the wind without ringing. "I do," Gideon said. "That's why it's going public." Pike straightened a little, dragging dignity back over himself like a man adjusting a coat. "You think truth is holy because you've suffered. It isn't. Truth is expensive. Towns die from it. Jobs vanish. Families lose homes. Institutions go under. People who did nothing wrong get punished beside the guilty." "You mean people lose the lie you sold them?" "I mean people need something to stand on." Gideon looked past him at Birch Harbor spread along the shore in the distance. Bright roofs, green trees, the neat line of streets and docks. All of it beautiful, all of it real, and all of it standing too close to something foul. "No," Gideon said quietly. "They need ground that isn't rotten." Pike tried one last shape of persuasion then, the oldest one. "You were in it too." That landed because it was true enough to bruise. Gideon felt the old guilt rise like cold lake water around his ribs. Firebreak. The tape. The ridge. The scope. The ignorance that no longer excused function. "Yes," he said. "That's why I'm not stepping aside." Something in Pike's face gave way then. Not conscience, but calculation collapsing under failed arithmetic. He lunged suddenly, perhaps to shove past Gideon, perhaps to grab the evidence pouch at his side. He never made it. Owen emerged from the chapel steps behind them with Kells's sidearm in both hands and shouted for Pike to get on the ground. This time the command came clear, adult, and earned. Pike froze. Gideon took him down hard enough to make sure Charm would not stand back up. Inside the chapel, the room had already changed shape. The two hired men were restrained with extension cord and altar rope. Kells sat on a chair, wrists bound, head lowered, as if the weight of his own collapse had finally reached his spine. Nolan Pierce stood over the evidence table while Asa Bell, hands shaking, called the state authorities from a number he had kept for years and prayed never to use. Tessa Brennan arrived 20 minutes later with Milo's hidden memory card. She came in her flannel shirt and worn jeans, hair half loose, face pale with fear and urgency. Behind her, Maribel held one steadying hand at her back. Tessa went straight to Gideon, opened a small dented kite box she had carried under one arm, and took out the card with trembling fingers. "He hid it in here," she said, "inside the tail seam. He thought nobody would look in something boring." The video confirmed the rest. The ghost boat was real. The boxes were real. And when the drone dipped, the face that lifted toward it belonged not to a stranger from nowhere, but to a local man long trusted to stand near every ribbon-cutting and fundraiser without anyone wondering what his clean hands had once moved in dirt. By noon, Pike and Kells were in custody. By 1, the state police had sealed the chapel and the freight route records. By 2, reporters were already heading north, but one name remained loose: Silas Wren. They found him before evening because Rook refused to let the hunt go cold. The dog tracked from the warehouse fire site to the edge of the reeds north of town, then along a narrow game path to a weather-beaten cabin, half hidden behind cattails and scrub willow. Owen came with Gideon. No speeches, no backup parade. Just two men who understood some endings had to be faced directly. Silas was inside, trying to bandage his wrist. In daylight, he looked older than the voice in the speaker had sounded. Leaner, hollower, the old sharp face cut deeper by years off the books. His dark hair was threaded with gray now. His eyes, once merely hard, had gone almost translucent with long isolation and longer self-justification. Yet he still moved with dangerous precision, as if time had never been allowed to soften him properly. When he saw Gideon and Rook in the doorway, he gave a small, tired smile. "I wondered if it'd be the dog that found me," he said. "It was," Gideon replied. Silas did not reach for the pistol on the table. Perhaps he knew he was finished. Perhaps some part of him had grown tired of outliving his own obituary. Owen cuffed him while Gideon watched. By sunset, Firebreak had a living face to answer for. The victory did not feel like triumph. It felt like surgery. Birch Harbor reeled. The water festival was postponed indefinitely. Local papers were joined by state cameras and whispered phone calls. People stood in grocery aisles and parking lots trying to understand how many years of civic pride had been built beside sealed rot. Some cried, some denied. Some got angry at the truth because anger was easier than grief. Maribel did not sleep much that week. Tessa cried over Milo only after he was safe enough to smile again. Owen walked differently in uniform after that, as though every step now carried an argument with the badge instead of trust in it. And Gideon stayed. That surprised even him. He did not stay because he had been cleared by the evidence. He had not. He did not stay because redemption had arrived tied up neatly like a solved case. It had not. He stayed because, for the first time in years, he understood that atonement was not motion. It was endurance. Standing still long enough for the light to find every part of what you had tried to leave unnamed. A week later, Birch Harbor gathered by the lake in place of the festival fireworks. No music. No speeches beyond what decency required. Just water, wind, white birch trees bright as bones in summer sun, and a line of people holding silence together because words had become too small for the size of what had broken. Gideon stood a little apart from them with Rook at his side, one hand resting on the dog's neck. Rook looked up at him once, calm and certain, with the expression of a creature that had never mistaken the road for the destination. At dawn the next morning, Gideon and Rook sat at the old wooden dock above the brightening lake. The gunfire was gone. The buried names were no longer buried. And as the first clean light spread across the water, Gideon understood that the lake itself seemed changed, not because it had become innocent, but because it had stopped being asked to hide. In the end, this story reminds us that evil does not always arrive wearing a frightening face. Sometimes it hides behind respectability, polite words, and the comfort of routine. But truth has a way of rising, and when it does, it often comes through the courage of the wounded, the loyalty of the faithful, and the quiet voice inside us that refuses to accept a lie as peace. Gideon learned that redemption is not found in running from the past, but in standing still long enough to face it honestly. Rook reminds us that love, loyalty, and instinct can become instruments of grace. Sometimes God does not send thunder. Sometimes he sends a warning no one else can hear, a faithful companion, a second chance, or the strength to do what is right when doing what is easy would cost the soul. The lesson is simple, but hard. What is hidden in darkness will not stay buried forever. Truth matters, integrity matters, and even a broken life can still become useful in God's hands. Many of us carry guilt, disappointment, fear, or old wounds that still follow us like shadows. But this story reminds us that God can bring light even into the places we are ashamed to open. He can use pain to awaken courage, use loss to uncover purpose, and use even the smallest act of faithfulness to protect someone else. In everyday life, that means we should not ignore what we know is wrong just because silence feels safer. It means we should protect the vulnerable, listen to our conscience, and trust that doing the right thing is never wasted, even when it is costly. It means that sometimes the miracle is not that trouble never comes, but that God gives us the strength, the people, and the timing to walk through it without losing our souls. If this story touched your heart, let it be more than just a story. Let it be a reminder to stand for truth, to stay faithful in quiet places, and to believe that God still works through courage, mercy, and unexpected companions. Please share in the comments what part of this story moved you most, and whether you have ever seen God work through an unexpected moment in your own life. Share this video with someone who may need hope today. And if you believe stories like this still matter, subscribe to the channel and stay with us for more journeys of faith, courage, healing, and second chances. May God bless every person watching. May He protect your home, strengthen your heart, heal what is wounded in you, and guide your steps when the road feels dark. May His peace rest over your family, and may His light always find you when you need it most. Amen.